Hey everyone, Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, bringing you 10 players to cut for Week 8. We made it through that crazy Week 7 bye week, but to make it through that bye week, we might have had to cut some pretty solid players just to make room for somebody that was active. But that means that there is value on waivers, and to get that value, we have to cut someone. So let's go ahead and dive right into it with players to cut for 12 to 14 team leagues. First up, Sam Darnold. The past 3 weeks for Sam Darnold have been extremely rough. Let's go ahead and break it down. He failed to top 210 pass yards in any game. He failed to have a QB rating higher than 57.2. He had only 6 rushing attempts for 58 yards and no touchdowns. He had just 2 passing touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Now, I'm not going to be extremely mean about it. Some of this obviously has to do with the absence of Christian McCaffrey. This offense is just much easier to game plan for without the most versatile running back in the league. But things imploded on Sunday when Darnold was benched and PJ Walker came into the game. But PJ Walker did the unthinkable. He was even worse than Sam Darnold, going just 3 for 14 with no touchdowns and 1 rush for 13 yards. So Darnold's starting position is probably safe from PJ Walker, and the Panthers have been adamant that they are not pursuing Deshaun Watson. But let's be honest, no one is going to outright say that they are shopping for Deshaun Watson right now. It's still a possibility after a 4-game losing streak. Darnold is clearly on shaky ground. It's also possible that Darnold bounces back when Christian McCaffrey returns. Until McCaffrey comes back or Darnold starts playing better, it just makes no sense to roster a poor streaming option that might not even be the starter for much longer. If you're holding on, it's time to let him go. Next up, Justin Fields. Justin Fields is back on the list this week, and I'm gonna guess that this is the last time we will have to talk about it. I cannot fathom who is willing to hold him for much longer. The Bears are making all kinds of history, and none of it is good. Per Andrew Siciliano, the Bears are the first team since the 2008 Tennessee Titans to start the first 7 games of the season without 200 passing yards in any game. That Titans team started the season off undefeated with one of the best rushing offenses in the league. So that's why. These Bears right here, they're anything but undefeated and bombed on Sunday, losing 38-3 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Fields is only rostered in 26% of Yahoo leagues and 21.9% of ESPN.com leagues, which is a good sign. Fantasy managers seem to be making the right decision. But that percentage is still too high because at this point, he's not even usable in Superflex. Now, he's not 100% to blame for his struggles. The Bears are trying to take a mobile quarterback and turn him into a pocket passer on a team that barely has a functioning offensive line. Fields only had 4 fantasy points on Sunday with 184 yards, 3 interceptions, and 2 lost fumbles. Most weeks, he is among the worst of fantasy quarterbacks. The fact that fantasy managers are hanging on to him, hoping that something will change, is just an unwise decision. Matt Nagy needs to be fired, and the scheme needs to change before he has any chance to put up fantasy numbers that make him worthy of a roster spot. Next up, Damien Williams. Sometimes missing 1 game is all you need to lose an opportunity for playing time, and that's what happened with Williams. My main reason for loving David Montgomery preseason was that the Bears aren't afraid to give a single running back literally the entire workload, and apparently that back will not be Damien Williams. This is not a performance issue, it's timing. So let's break down the timeline of Damien Williams' unfortunate move to 3rd string running back. Prior to going on the COVID list, Williams had 16 carries for 64 yards and a touchdown in Week 5. He seemed set up to be the primary beneficiary of David Montgomery's injury and have a big game against Green Bay in Week 6. But Williams tested positive for COVID, missed the game, and Khalil Herbert stepped in for a huge game. And in Week 7, with both of them active, Williams had 3 rushes for 5 yards and 1 catch for 3 yards, while Herbert had 18 carries for 100 yards and 5 receptions for 33 yards. David Montgomery should be coming back soon, and it appears that Herbert is going to be the bell cow until that happens, with Williams having a very small role. That role could evaporate altogether when Montgomery is cleared to play. There just doesn't seem to be much of a role for Williams as the 3rd running back on this team. Williams went from being a great fantasy ad to a player that should not be on a fantasy roster in literally just a couple of weeks. It's time to let him go. Next up, Sony Michel. Unless you have room for a handcuff on your bench, it's time to let go of Sony Michel. He has no role in this offense that would make him remotely usable. The Rams were expected to have a big lead in the Week 7 game, but instead, the Lions started off hot and the Rams needed time to take them over in the fourth quarter. As a result, Sony Michel had 2 carries for 4 yards. Darrell Henderson, on the other hand, logged 15 attempts for 45 yards and 3 receptions for an additional 19 yards. Not a fantastic game on Henderson's part, but the clear and unquestioned lead running back. Michel's only value is as a handcuff that you should not start unless Henderson is hurt. Next up, Rhamondre Stevenson. Of all the players on this list, I probably feel the most confident saying that unless you are playing in a dynasty league, you should feel very comfortable letting go of Rhamondre Stevenson. You don't want to be on this roller coaster. Let's break down the numbers. Stevenson went from having 11 carries in Week 5 to 5 carries in Week 6 to being a healthy scratch in Week 7. The reality of the Patriots' backfield is that Damien Harris is the lead back and Brandon Bolden is the receiving back. Stevenson and JJ Taylor alternate as the third back, and if one of them blows a blitz pickup or fumbles a ball, that player usually ends up being a healthy scratch and the other player earns a spot in the rotation. Now, Taylor may do something in Week 8 against the Los Angeles Chargers to lose that spot and Stevenson get back into the mix in Week 9 at Carolina. The question is, though, does it make sense to roster a player that is literally a coin flip to be active and a coin flip to see more than 5 touches if he is active? Taylor did score 2 touchdowns last week, but that's because the Patriots beat the New York Jets 54-13. Had that game been competitive, Harris would have seen more than 14 touches and Taylor would not have been fantasy relevant. There are too many variables to use a roster spot on a guy like Rhamondre Stevenson. Next up, Rondale Moore. This one hurts, I know, but we need to come to terms with reality that this is just not the year for Rondale Moore from a fantasy perspective. I know that Moore will likely have another 80-yard touchdown at some point during the season and be back on the fantasy map. He'll be a waiver ad and then miraculously have 2 receptions for 15 yards and break your heart. Moore is essentially Henry Ruggs from 2020. Last year, Ruggs saw a few games where he caught a deep pass and put up some big points, but he also had 9 games where he had less than 5 fantasy points. Moore is likely to develop into a good receiver that will have fantasy value in 2022 or 2023, but right now, he's behind DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk, and AJ Green. He also has to compete with Chase Edmonds and Zach Ertz for targets as well. And breaking down the numbers since Week 3, Hopkins is the 14th ranked fantasy receiver, Green is the 23rd, Christian Kirk is the 25th, and Rondale Moore is the 65th. Now, none of this bodes well for Moore rest of season. Aside from a bye week filling gamble, it's time to let him go. Next up, Brandon Aiyuk. I commiserate with those who roster Brandon Aiyuk because I have him in multiple leagues and this is painful, so painful to say, and I do not believe that it's his fault, but we have to let him go. There's no excuse for why he isn't receiving targets and how it could even increase moving forward because George Kittle hasn't even been playing. Aiyuk had 1 target and 1 reception and 6 yards on Sunday. The numbers are just ugly. I don't want to break them down, but we have to, so let's do it. Since Kittle went out in Week 5, Aiyuk had 5 targets, 3 receptions, 48 yards, and no touchdowns. He is unplayable in fantasy at this point, and there is literally no reason to have him on your roster with that type of production. Moving on, we'll close out the 12 to 14 team leagues and move on to shallow leagues. First up, Nyheim Hines. I'm all for rostering high-end handcuffs, but is that really what Nyheim Hines is? He's rostered in 52% of leagues right now. You know who else is rostered in 52% of leagues? Alexander Mattison. One of these things is not like the other. The appeal of Nyheim Hines was that in addition to being a handcuff, he was also usable. But this week, Hines saw his most game action since Week 3 with 8 carries and 1 reception. Those 9 touches resulted in 14 rushing yards and -1 receiving. Jonathan Taylor has rushed for 100 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. He has found the end zone 6 times, and he even had 116 receiving yards against the Baltimore Ravens. Taylor is the bell cow, and even if Marlon Mack is treated, Hines is going to be a change of pace back that sees 6 to 8 touches per game. He is not worth rostering unless your league has so little on waivers that you are keeping him as a handcuff to Taylor and a dead roster spot. Next up, Trey Sermon. Trey Sermon did not log a single carry coming out of the bye week with JaMychal Hasty back in action. There's also the issue of Jeff Wilson eventually returning to action. In deeper leagues, sometimes you have to hold on to players without a role, hoping that an injury happens or some good practices can lead to an expanded role. Sermon has RB3 value with upside if he can see 15 to 20 carries. But there is no realistic path to that type of production right now, and I don't even think that the greatest practice in the world is going to make Kyle Shanahan change his mind. It's not worth holding on to someone like Sermon when there are definitely better options on waiver. And finally, Tyler Boyd. Boyd is the 80th ranked wide receiver over the last 3 games with just 11.5 fantasy points. When you consider the fact that his ADP for wide receivers was in the 30s at times during preseason, I can understand why people are holding on, because Boyd was a guy you drafted, not grabbed off waivers mid-season. It's hard to let go of the ones you drafted, but unfortunately, it's time to let go. Jamar Chase is the 2nd ranked wide receiver, T. Higgins is the 38th, CJ Uzama is the 6th ranked fantasy running back. That makes Boyd the 4th option in the passing game with their commitment to running the ball with Joe Mixon as well. There's just not enough footballs to support the 4th target in this offense. Deeper leagues may have to hold on to Boyd and hope that he finds a role due to injury. Managers in shallow leagues just need to let him go at this point. And that wraps up Players to Cut in Week 8. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros across all platforms, and be sure to come back next week for another round of Players to Cut.